Hi guys, so I wanted to make a quick refresher video with some tips and tricks in it on how to read and write decimals, and then we will get into adding and subtracting decimals. So first things first, we're in the decimal unit. Hopefully we're taking notes, so spiral notebooks are out. Write down what you need and follow along as I show you some tips and tricks. So we first need to know the definition of a decimal. So a decimal is a fraction whose denominator is 10 or a power of 10. So when I say power of 10, I'm talking about 10 to the first power, 10 to the second power, 10 to the third power. I'm multiplying 10 times itself multiple times. And when that happens, we are going to just keep adding zeros to our 10. So we know that when we are talking about 10 squared, we are multiplying 10 times 10. And in that situation, 10 times 10 is 100. And the way that we know this is we can count the number of zeros we have in our original multiplication problem, and that's how many zeros will be in our product. We also could look at our exponent, and that is going to tell us how many zeros are in our final product. 1/2 is not a formalized decimal quite yet, but we can turn it into a decimal quite quickly by building it up to a power of 10. And we know the closest power of 10 here will be 10 itself. And then we're thinking to ourselves, how did we go from 2 to 10? Well, we multiplied by 5. So we have to do the same thing to our numerator. So 1/2 we all know is 5/10. That's one of our must-know fractions. And we can easily rewrite 5/10 as a decimal with 5 in our tenths place. We read this as 5/10 and we read this as 5/10. So notice, this is a power of 10, this place value, the tenths place. Let's do something a little less obvious where we have 1/25. Now we don't read that, that's not a decimal quite yet, but we can turn it into a decimal by building it up to a power of 10. Our closest power of 10 here is 100. We know that 4 quarters go into a dollar, so we're going to build by 4. And we read this as 4 hundredths. Can easily be turned into 4 hundredths as a decimal, and we stop in the hundredths place. So here we have the tenths place, here we have the hundredths place. So take notice that our place values are all of those powers of 10. We're going to go up to the millionths place, but of course decimals can go even further than that. We can think of the decimal pi, which goes on forever and ever and ever and ever, non-repeating, non-terminating. So we have infinite amounts of decimal places that we can go. We also want to recall the uses of decimals. Again, we did this in our decimal basics folder where many of you wrote some really awesome answers. The most popular one is money, weights, stock market, sports stats, the Dewey Decimal System, which at this point probably isn't as commonly used, but some libraries do still use it, and radio stations. To quickly review our decimal places, I wanted to give you some tips and tricks. So when you are reading and writing decimals, in this situation this year, we're going to stop at the millionths place, but again, it can go way beyond that. We always want to recognize our decimal point is when we say the word and. So when you see that word and, that's where your decimal point goes. Our first decimal place is the tenths place. Then we have hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and millions. So what I always do is count the amount of decimal places that are in my decimal and think about what power of 10 has that many zeros. So if your decimal has 2 decimal places, 100 has 2 zeros in it, so you're in the hundredths place. If your decimal has 6 decimal places, well, 1 million has 6 zeros in it, so you land in the millionths place. So we're going to use this knowledge to help us write decimals. Let's start with a pretty basic one. So first things first, I'm going to look at my decimal places. I have 2 decimal places, so that tells me that I'm putting 2 zeros in my power of 10. That says 100. So we know we're landing in the hundredths place. Make sure you emphasize that THS at the end of your place value. So I read my whole number as I normally would, 2 and for my decimal point, and then I just read whatever number is left over. So you can sort of ignore the 2 for now, and this is read as 3 hundredths. 2 and 3 hundredths. Pretty straightforward and easy. Now here's one with a whole lot more decimal places. So we're going to count. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means there are 6 zeros in my power of 10, and we know that this number is 1 million. So my answer is going to stop in the millionths place. So again, you can write out the numbers to guide you. 6 places, we're in the millionths place. Read our whole number as usual, 7 and then again, I'm ignoring the 7 and reading just these 3 last numbers. 586, and we're in the millionths place. So 7 and 586 millionths. So if it helps you, you can cover up all the 7 and all of these zeros and just read your number as if it were a whole number and then slap on the place value name. We'll do one more. So here we have 0, so we don't even need to read that. Again, we have 6 decimal places, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we know we are in the millionths place. And again, if it helps you to write out the number 1 million to guide you, go for it. Read this as if it were a whole number. So right above it, I'm just going to write 3, 4, 5, comma, 6, 7, 8. And of course, this is just notes. We're not putting commas in our decimals. I'm just putting this up here to guide me when I read it. 345,678 millionths. So I'm reading it as if it were a whole number, but I'm not putting the comma inside of there and then slapping on millionths as my place value. 345,678 millionths. Also notice that I'm hyphenating my 2-digit numbers, 45, 78, from 21 all the way up to 99. We want to make sure we're hyphenating our 2-digit numbers that aren't multiples of 10. Do I have one more? Let's do one more. Last one. So go ahead and try this one on your own. You can pause the video. Again, count your place values. You can write that number in. Recall what number that is, and that's going to be your place value. And then read your whole number and then your decimal places I can put right above. So I have 32 and 25,874 hundred thousands because this is 100,000, so it's hundred thousands. Also take note that that is hyphenated. Adding and subtracting decimals have been something we've been reviewing all year through the Daily Depositor. Luckily for you, you have a Daily Depositor for the month of January all the way to June, so we'll always be adding decimals to practice. It's also a really common real-life skill, and we want to make sure that we understand how to add and subtract when we're dealing with money, which are decimals. Your biggest tip for adding and subtracting decimals is always remember to align your decimals vertically. Make sure the decimal points line up. So as you can see on your screen, all of my red decimal points are lined up. So for my people with big handwriting or maybe a little bit disorganized, graph paper is really going to help you here because you can line up each decimal inside of its own box. So the decimal point can go in its own box, and you can easily see where all of your decimal points are, so you can line everything up. And then you can add down just as if you would add or subtract whole numbers. So just as I would add whole numbers, I'm going to add straight down, moving from right to left. So I'm going to start with this rightmost column and move leftwards. So we're adding things up, 5, 10, 15, 20. And here our solution is 3 1/10 or 3 10/100ths, the way it's written here. The example we have on our screen, we're very lucky because all of our decimals are already written to the hundredths place because they have 2 place values, they're in the hundredths place. but not all decimals that we're given are going to be this pretty and lined up. You may have decimals that land in different decimal places. When that happens, for instance, in this example here, it says don't forget to line them up, but when I go to line them up, I need to remember that some of my decimals are written in the tens place and some of them are written in the hundredths place. So I can't start writing my decimals and then realize that my decimals are diagonal like this. So I caution you to always take a look at the decimals you're adding and make sure they land in the same amount of decimal places. If not, you can put in any holding zeros. So put a 0 in the place value that you need your decimal to go to, because we can add infinite zeros to the end of our decimal and it does not change my decimal at all. Now that I've done that, my decimals will line up and I will be able to add them all. Rules apply for subtracting decimals. Make sure you're lining up your decimal point, making sure that your decimals end in the same place value, and put in any holding zeros or placeholders so that you can line up your decimal points. And don't forget, just like in whole numbers, we may have to regroup, borrowing from the whole number and bringing over to the tenths, hundredths, thousandths, or even millionths place. As you see in this example, we have 4 3/10 minus 2 5/100. We already know by reading them out loud, we have a decimal that ends in the tenths place and a decimal that ends in the hundredths place. When this happens, don't forget to put a 0 at the end of your decimal so you can line up your decimal point and then start to subtract. And that's it. That's all we need to know about adding and subtracting decimals. If you know how to add and subtract whole numbers, you're treating it the exact same way, but we want to make sure we line up our decimal point.